And to talk about climate change, it is a great pleasure to welcome our guest, His Excellency Adnan Amin, the Director General of IRENA.
Thank you very much. Obviously, it will be a hard act to follow. Your former boss,
yes,
in fact. But I'm sure we'll have a very interesting conversation. So, IRENA has just held its assembly here in Abu Dhabi. Just very briefly, we don't have an awful lot of time, but just very briefly, what was the most important thing to come out of that assembly? Could you just summarize it for us?
Well, I think that there is now a very strong global recognition that the momentum of energy transition is now unstoppable, that the business case for decarbonization is now a compelling one, and that the future of energy is going to be dramatically different to the one we see today. I think that's the key thing, and that this is going to have broader geopolitical implications.
Okay, so I actually wanted to ask you about these broader geopolitical implications, because the geopolitics of today have, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, to a significant extent, been shaped by the availability and the trade in the thing that powers, until now, predominantly the global economy, which is fossil fuels. So this new energy mix that IRENA, among others, have been promoting, and that is necessary if the world is to meet the Paris Agreement's ambitious targets on climate mitigation and avert catastrophic climate change, that will necessarily have to change that power dynamic and those geopolitics. So how do you think that will happen? What changes will we see in the geopolitics of energy?
That's a very long question, but let me say that what we're seeing in terms of all of the trends are that the basic driver of transformation is now becoming technology innovation and investment. And when you look at technology innovation, what we're seeing is the emergence of new technologies that are transforming, at the moment, electricity. So the advent of solar photovoltaics, which is cheapest form of power generation in more and more parts of the world, concentrated solar now becoming a real cost-competitive option on the grid, wind, both onshore and offshore wind, having a big perspective for the future, that decarbonized electricity from renewables will become dominant. But this will be on the basis of a technology innovation that allows the adoption of technologies that can manage variability in electricity systems in new ways, and the advent of machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain trading of electricity. These are all innovations that we're seeing that are going to be transformative. So when that starts to happen, we think that the future of electricity will be much more about electrification. And as electrification becomes the dominant form of energy, then the impact on the traditional fuels will be quite substantial. And when that starts to happen, the complexion of geopolitics that we've known over the last 50 years will begin to evolve very rapidly. We will move from a situation where you have geographical constraints on natural resources with the domination of a limited number of players globally, who are able to exert a certain type of energy statecraft because of resource endowment, will change when you have a much more broadly distributed energy capability, because almost every country has renewables capability.
But let me stop you there for a moment. So obviously that's true, but the technology, the deployment of the technology may be very broad, but the construction of the technology and the resources which are needed in order to erect this technology, they will still come from particular places more than from others, especially for batteries. I mean, the cobalt, everybody's talking about how cobalt is the new oil because of its importance for battery technology. So will the Democratic Republic of Congo become the new Gulf?
I think the resource constraint issue is constantly overstated by the press that has a lot of its experience in the conventional industry. During our roundtable on innovation, the minister from Japan actually announced their innovation in solid-state batteries that changed the chemistry of batteries. We also know that this whole discussion that has taken place on...
China is working on this as well.
Yes, China is working on that big time. Yeah. The whole discussion on rare earths, for example.
Which are not so
Everybody
rare.
said rare earth. Rare earth is not rare. It's available everywhere. It's a question of how do you extract it. Cobalt will be important, lithium will be important, but there are also alternatives that are emerging because of the pace of technology innovation that we see. So I think that this technology innovation, for me, it's analogous to some of the massive changes we've seen that have been driven by information communication technologies, the internet, artificial intelligence, will be applied to the energy industry, and we're going to see a very different form of power generation, electrification, trade in electricity becoming dominant form, and the old energy statecraft will have to evolve to a much more distributed and democratized energy world.
So do you already see signs of this change? Because you keep talking in the future tense, we will see this. Are we seeing it anywhere already? Is there any hint that the traditional geopolitics are being surpassed by these new geopolitics?
Yes, Jan, just look at the country you're sitting in. You have an oil-producing country that has built its considerable wealth on the basis of its natural resource endowment, but that is also convinced that the future is going to be very different, as is now investing in the future energy that we will see. The most mature market in the GCC region for renewables today is the UAE. They have a target of 44% renewables by 2050 and a 70% decarbonization. And just to show what is happening around that, because if you just look at the capacity numbers, that's very impressive. But you know that the Interconnection Authority of the GCC has an agreement now. All of these economies are interconnected. The future of electricity trade is going to be very strong here. And we're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that the Chinese are investing heavily in grid infrastructure worldwide. They have an initiative in their Belt and Road Initiative that is looking at electricity interconnection and generating vast amounts of cheap renewable electricity.
But that's definitely true for local energy use. But what makes the Gulf and other energy producers punch above their weight in many ways around the world is the fact that they are the source of energy for everybody else. Now, you can convert your own energy mix to renewables, and that's great, and that's very laudable. But the fact that there will be less demand for the principal export is going to diminish that weight, necessarily. So that's the sort of geopolitical change that we're talking about, right?
Yes, but it also, there are two things. One is that there's going to be opportunities for countries that are dependent on resources for importation of energy resources that have huge supply and price volatility that has an impact on development. That will be a positive impact on those countries, that they will achieve larger shares of energy independence and energy autonomy in their decision-making and predictability in pricing. For energy producers, the impact is going to be that the nature of the energy industry is going to change, and the adaptation of those countries to be able to move to more higher tech, more innovative economies that are based on new technologies will be decisive in terms of how they adapt to the geopolitical change. And I think that sitting here, we are beginning to see the contours of that. There's some of them, like the UAE, who are making very foresighted decisions about this.
So that was exactly that was going to be my next question. Can you name some countries which are actually, some energy producers which are taking the right steps and have the foresight to ensure that they can survive in this new geopolitics?
Well, I think the UAE, as I said, is one of them. But
what's it doing? From your perspective, from IRENA, what is it doing that will allow it to maintain its considerable clout and its prosperity?
What we're seeing right now is a huge investment into technology innovation, a huge investment in capacity addition of renewables. In the pipeline, you have several gigawatts of renewable energy capacity that's going to come on stream in the next 5 years. They are actually reducing their own dependency on fossil fuels. but they're also positioning themselves for the next stage of the evolution of fossil fuels, which is going to be much more in the petrochemical industry. So it's not like we are not going to have oil anymore as of tomorrow because we've got a solar panel on our roof. It's that the nature of the industry is going to change, and trade in commodities is going to change, and that is going to have geopolitical implications in terms of those who are incumbents in this industry right now who are benefiting from it, unless they're able to adapt. So the UAE is one of them. And you know, I think that when I talk to a lot of decision makers from oil exporting countries today, you see a realization of this. If you just look at the recent Saudi Arabian announcement of 60 gigawatts in the next 3 or 4 years of capacity from renewables. If you just look at the fact that Masdar has just won the first bid for wind generation, which is at 2 cents a kilowatt hour for 400 megawatts in Saudi Arabia, and you look at Vision 2030, they're positioning themselves on this. Of course, we'll have to see the performance against the vision. That's going to be a key determinant. But that is evolving in more and more countries around the world.
So we only have about a minute left, but this brings me to another question, which I think is extremely important. So you mentioned that the availability of energy will be much more distributed in this new world. Does this also mean that multilateral action on climate change will be more distributed? There'll be a greater incentive for global collective action because the power will be less concentrated?
Absolutely. I think, you know, if trade in energy becomes trade in electricity that crosses national borders, if we have systemic threats potentially like cybersecurity, if we need global standards that allow us to have a productive energy system in the future, multilateralism is absolutely essential to making this happen. But it has to be a different type of multilateralism. The multilateralism we see today is trying to correct problems that are arising. The multilateralism of tomorrow has to look at the opportunities we have and how do we design a more proactive approach to be able to deal with them. So I think multilateralism has to change. I've spent my life in multilateral institutions, and I believe it's indispensable.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has been an incredible conversation. I'm sure we could go on for much longer. And thank you very much.
Thank you.